this is our fourth and final show and tell. Thank you for joining us. During August, we've been documenting all of our findings from the previous 3 sprints into the final report. Today, we're going to go a bit of an overview of all of those findings. We're going to do it in 42 slides, whereas the final report we've put together is 161 pages. So hopefully you'll thank us for that slimmed down version. We're going to show 2 Figma prototypes as well around the chip and pin journeys and another journey as well. I'm going to hand over to Isabel to do an introduction and get us started, and then during the course of this you've got Glenn Conroy from Dorset who will present around the infrastructure and the architecture and some of the other epics we've been working on, and then I'll come back for the conclusions at the end. Okay, Isabel, over to you.
Thanks, Richard. So I'm Isabel and I was the delivery lead working with the team throughout the Alpha, and I'm going to just briefly recap what we did during Alpha before Richard shows some of the features that we focused on. Next slide, please, or slide 4. Cool. So in May we formed our multidisciplinary team, and this was formed between the 3 partner councils at Barnsley, Dorset and Huntingdonshire, and we worked together for 6 fortnightly sprints, and DXW were the delivery partner throughout the project. Next slide, please. We started by setting our vision, identifying goals and scope for the Alpha. And our vision, written on this slide, was about creating a supported payment and income service designed by local government for local government that provides a good, inclusive, open and flexible experience, offering value for money and reducing total cost of ownership. And that vision recognises the draft local gov digital procurement checklist, which we also considered during our discovery phase as well. And some of those words kind of mirror the words within that checklist. So after we had a vision, we shaped our goals for the IMS and the Alpha project. And the first goal was about a better experience for those that use and deliver payment and income services by designing a user-centered service that meets their needs. The second goal was about value for money, demonstrating that councils can save money and run more efficient processes by adopting the future service. The next goal was about open by design, and that was about sharing an open, configurable cloud-hosted system with a flexible support model that councils can absorb. The fourth goal was about collaboration, not just about the project and the Alpha delivery itself, but in the future as well, when the IMS is shared between councils. And after we had our goals, we set the scope for the Alpha project itself, and that was about defining the end-to-end IMS proposition for users, which we're going to talk about today. Next slide, please. So to achieve our vision and our goals, we thought about the activities we needed to do during Alpha, and we identified 7 epic activities, which kind of split into these 4 areas, being the context, which is about mapping the landscape, one around the users of the service, the product, which is about journeys and architecture and infrastructure, and then the surrounding service, which is about support, the cost model and service governance. Next slide, please. So in terms of what we did to fulfill those epics in a bit more detail, as Richard said, our report shares a lot more detail on what we did. Next slide. Thank you. So to start with, we needed to understand the environment that the IMS would operate within. So we collaboratively mapped out the landscape, and we started by creating a conceptual model of the IMS itself, which outlined its key functions as a technical system. After that, we began to map the wider ecosystem with the IMS at the center of that ecosystem. We plotted all the different interfaces in and out to give us a picture of this complete landscape. And the final map showed how many different systems and processes that the IMS would touch. And this helped us to identify that the IMS was middleware. And later into the project, we also created a capability model. And this helped show further detail about the integrations to the IMS itself. Next slide, please. Thanks. So after we gained our understanding of the landscape, we needed to understand who the IMS would cater for. We built on what we'd understood in discovery during alpha, and we wanted to ensure that our proposition would meet the needs of the future users. So we decided to create council personas to help us understand the differences between users and the differences between those users' needs. An example of that would be that we found as a finance officer in one council may need lots of technical support, whereas a finance officer in another council may have not needed support. And the difference was due to their level of digital capability between the organisations which they worked within. One organisation had a small IT department and relied on suppliers for support, whereas the other had a large IT department and could manage things in-house. So our personas kind of thought about those things we learned about councils throughout alpha and were based around that. So the full council personas shown on this slide, we tested them with the 3 councils working together on alpha, and we found that between us, we spread across the 4 personas and were able to identify a persona that reflected our needs. We also wanted to test these personas with a council that wasn't working on the alpha project, so we tested them with Croydon Council, and they recognised and identified the personas too, which helped validate them for us. And now I'm going to hand back to Richard. He's going to talk through the user journeys and show some of the product features that we focused on in alpha.
Thanks. So having gained an understanding of the landscape of the system and the users who are going to use it, we needed to think about the missing product features that came out during discovery. So they were, how would the IMS handle face-to-face payments with chip and pin? Because as we built the system in Barnsley, we didn't have that need, so it didn't have that capability. How we'd handle automated telephone payments, because whilst it has that capability in Barnsley, it was using our own telephony system, which if we were to offer it out wider, other councils wouldn't have. So obviously we can't just go ahead and use that. And then 2 of the big needs that we kind of brought together here were councils wanted to be able, or said they needed to be able to configure their own imports and exports and processing rules. So with imports and exports, we're talking about, let's say they set up a new contract with a new bailiff company. That bailiff company is going to provide them with a file about the payments that they've taken for them. How do we absorb that new file in? Typically, that's meant going back to the supplier, the incumbent supplier, and having that configured and set up. Councils wanted to be able to do it themselves, so they've got much more flexibility. And it means that if they change a line of business system, they can also then configure those themselves as well, so they can pass details back and forth. And then with processing rules, this was about where, let's say someone pays their council tax bill, and instead of having their account reference on the bank statement, they're using Mr. Smith's council tax. If that happens repeatedly, we want to be able to capture that and say, whenever you see this incorrect reference, switch it to this correct reference, and do that every time you run an import file, pick up the rules and sort that for them. So those are the 4 missing features. Starting with the face-to-face chip and pin payments. The thing about chip and pin devices that we sort of recognised during all the work we did was that they're standalone devices, right? So when it comes to needing a payment, a staff member, an officer will tap in on the device the amount that they want the customer to pay. The customer will enter their card, put their PIN number in, and it'll take the payment for them. And it does that sort of standalone, doesn't touch the IMS. It was between the machine, the device itself, and the bank. And that's all fine. It takes the payment for them, no problem. But when that payment arrives on the bank file, usually a few days later, how are we going to reconcile it? How do we know what it was for? Because the IMS hasn't been involved in that transaction. So what we recognised was we needed to somehow tag that payment or tell the IMS that a payment was coming and this was what to watch out for. So we could either tag the payments with a reference number before they were taken, or tag something in the IMS after the payment was taken so that when it arrived later from the bank, we could reconcile it. I hope that makes sense. I'm sort of speaking on behalf of our subject matter expert here, so hopefully that makes sense. In terms of tagging payments before they're taken, it's not something you can do with a traditional chip and pin machine. These older devices just don't support it. They let you put in the amount and then they expect a card. That's it. When we start to look at newer devices, like you'll have seen them, I'm sure, in sort of barbershops and hairdressers and places like that, cafes and what have you, these iZettles, SumUp, Square, those sort of devices, they're typically linked to a mobile device which has a custom point of sale application on it. And with those, you can add extra detail to the payment transaction. So with those devices, it is possible to tag up front. With the older devices, when they've taken a payment, they'll give you a reference number. So you can capture that at that point, give that to the IMS, and then use that when the detail comes in on the bank file. So there are two ways around it. Now, the newer devices aren't in use so much at the moment in councils, but I imagine we need to cater for them. If we're going to provide an IMS system sort of centrally for everybody, then we can't sort of say, oh, you must use the older devices and we'll configure the system to work like this. We need to be able to cater for both. The newer devices, incidentally, I imagine take-up will improve, because we were quoted for a traditional device, £440 upfront for the device and £44 per annum every year to maintain it. With the new device, a new device from Square, for example, costs £199 one-off and there is no maintenance fee. So these devices are cheaper and they give you more capability. So I think as we move forward, the likelihood of those coming into the mix will increase. So we put together some prototypes, which I'll click to now. We did these as mobile screens. The next set of prototypes I'll show you are desktop screens, just to put some a bit of variety into the mix. But we imagined the chip and pin journey working like this. We did a bunch of Crazy 8 workshops and a lot of mapping to get to this. But a staff member would sign into the IMS. Customer would say they want to pay the council tax, so we'd enter the reference number and the amount, and that would build up. And while they're here, they also want to make a payment for a parking fine. So we'll add that detail in too. I don't know how quickly these screens refresh, so I'm taking it steady. At this point, we've got two references in there, a council tax reference and a parking fine reference, and we're going to take that forward to make a payment. Now, at this point, the agent would tap in 21422 on the device and hand that to the user to put the card details in. When that transaction's taken, there'll be an authorization code presented on the chip and pin device, and we can capture that here and confirm it. And that's great. Alternatively, if we were using one of the newer devices, we could have the IMS monitor, say, for example, the iZettle APIs or the Square APIs, and watch for that payment arriving for that amount within the next sort of minute or so. And as it does that, capture that the payment's completed automatically. So we don't ask the staff member to take any kind of detail off the device. It's all just done seamlessly behind the scenes. Once that's done, we can then print a receipt for the customer, or we can give them the option to email it to them as well. So that's the prototype we've ended up putting together around that. Moving on to automated telephone payments. There are two main considerations for this. So when we're talking about automated telephone payments, councils will typically either publish a phone number that they want people to use to ring, and that will be a specific number just for ATP payments, or councils will publish a phone number where a customer will enter an IVR system, and at some point through the menus there, they will jump out to an ATP service. We have to figure out how we integrate into this. So we come back a little bit. When you're making an ATP payment, you ring the phone number, the customer's prompted for a reference number, an amount, and the card details, and the payment's taken and the customer's given a receipt number. So reconciliation with ATP isn't a problem because we've got the reference number that the customer entered and we've got the receipt number. So we can easily tie those transactions back together in the IMS. The trick is, how do we get the customer to the ATP service? Do we integrate with an existing council's IVR? So at some point within their menu systems, it says, press 3 to make a payment, press 1 for a parking fine payment, press 2 for a council tax payment. And depending on what they press, we jump them out to the right number to make just that payment. Or do we handle the menus on the IMS side? And do we say, with the ATP service there, you go through a council's IVR system to a point, you say press 3 to make a payment, and at that point you then jump out to our system and we say press 1 for council tax, press 2 for parking fines, and we handle that on this end. Or do we provide a completely separate number for every payment? So if you want to pay a council tax, you dial 0800, whatever it might be. And if you want to pay parking fines, it's a completely different number again. So there's some work to do around that to figure out which option we go with, and I'll come on to why we haven't made a decision on that in a second. The other thing is, when a customer's tapping in a reference number to make a payment, how do we validate that that's a good reference? Because if we take a payment with our ATP service for an invalid reference, there's then got to be some manual effort afterwards to take that out of suspense and put it into the right cost centres and accounts and ledgers. So how do we validate them? There's a couple of different ways to do that. We could use simple regular expression matching. All council tax numbers are 12 digits for this council and they all start with 77. We could do that. That won't validate that the reference is valid, it'll just validate that it follows the right pattern. So there's some pros and cons with that. We could upload all valid references periodically, say every morning, from a council into the IMS and have them checked that they are actually real references. But then there's an integration piece to worry about there. So there's pros and cons with that. Or we could do callback routines where every time the ATP service gets a reference number, it makes a web service call and says, tell me if this is valid or not. And that web service is somewhere back in a council replying, yes, that's a valid reference, or no, it's not. That then puts some onus on councils, and so there are pros and cons around that. Now, as we're looking with this whole project to integrate with gov.uk Pay for all our customer not present card payments, we spoke to them about whether or not standing up an ATP service might be something they could do as part of the gov.uk Pay product. The alternative is we build something with Twilio and put it all together ourselves, but a lot of that work's already there with gov.uk Pay. So they consider there's value to it, and they've added it to their development roadmap. So hopefully we'll be working through a lot of that with them going forwards. The conclusions about what we do with the IVR systems and the validation largely depends on how that piece of work goes with them. Needless to say, we can mix and match all the various different options, and we'll see how that goes as we move forward. So that's ATP. On the file imports and exports and processing rules, we found there were 3 different ways to give councils the ability to handle these themselves. The first one was allowing finance staff to configure their own imports and exports and their own processing rules. The second was to give IT teams in councils a way for them to do it for the finance team. And the third way is pretty much what we have now, is where we let the suppliers do it. We've done some prototypes on this, and I'll show them in a second. But before I do, I want to say that we tested the prototypes that we put together, having gone through all the journeys and figured out how they needed to work. And we tested them with our finance subject matter expert on the project, and we tested them with our IT subject matter experts on the project. Now, the finance people found the import and export interfaces too complex. And we concluded that the complexity wasn't in the interfaces themselves, or rather it was driven by the fact that all the different file types that we get from different back office systems, different bailiff companies, different banks, they all follow different formats. Some are CSV, some are text, some are JSON, some are XML. The reference numbers are sometimes padded and fixed width. They're sometimes just truncated to what they are. Some are comma separated, some are tab delimited. There's so much difference that the interfaces have to be so advanced that configurations can be done to handle all these different options. And that in itself makes them too complicated for finance teams to work with them. So we've essentially concluded with this that those interfaces aren't going to add any value, but there's still a user need for councils to be able to configure their own imports and exports. So having tested them with the IT teams, saying, okay, these are too complex for the finance teams, but could you work with them? The IT teams liked them, thought they were helpful, but when it comes to managing income, if something goes wrong, it can be quite a big job to fix it, to negate lots of transactions and undo the errors. They prefer to script changes like this. So if they're putting a new import process in, a new scheduled import or scheduled export, they like to script that functionality. So while the interfaces are sort of there and helpful, they'd rather just get in and do some dynamic scripting. So that led us to these prototypes. And we've done these ones as desktop. So they would log into the IMS system. And here you can see we're in the import export section, and we've got a few imports and exports already set up. If I go to create a new one, we give it a name. We give it a sample import file. So let's say this is an upload from a bailiffs. We tell it that this data has some headers, so ignore those. We don't want to use those when we're processing the transactions. We want to skip empty rows. This file actually doesn't have transactions starting until row 6 or 7. The first few rows are just metadata. So we'll tell it that here, and we'll give it some other details about minimum maximum line lengths. That gives us this kind of interface. You'll be familiar with this from importing text files into Excel. It gives you this kind of setup. So here we can start to say, okay, from character 0 to for 17 characters from character 0, we've got a reference number here, and we're going to set this to be a number, and we want it to trim any spaces off around the edge. From character 18 for the next 16 characters, there's nothing here. We're going to ignore that, it's blank. From character 34 for 30 characters, this is perhaps a narrative. It's just some useful data that we're not really going to do anything with. And then we can carry on doing that for the rest of the fields. And there's all kind of options in here to set those up. Once we've done that and we've configured what fields are where, down the left-hand side here, these are the fields that the income management system cares about and needs to know. So what we're saying is the transaction date, you can find that at field 4, or as we had here, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you can map them together, essentially. So we continue that through. We tell it that to validate this, we want to make sure that the first record doesn't contain, a string when it should contain a number. And we can put a bunch of validation rules in there just to make sure the file isn't processed if it's not absolutely spot on, because sometimes erroneous files do arrive. And then we get a bit of a test with the sample file that we uploaded that tells us we've passed. We can go back if we haven't, and it gives us an example of what it's going to process through. So you can understand why finance teams thought that might be a bit complex. Once that's done, we can schedule the thing or choose that we want it to run when a file's put into the Dropbox, or we don't want to schedule it and we'll just run it manually each time. We give it a file name to look for in the Dropbox, a mask, and then that's it, that import's created. And if we look at this existing one here, we've got for ABC gyros, we can get a view of when it runs, when it last ran, was there an error? Actually, there was an unexpected character on 3, so the system stopped running at that point. Where the IT teams looked at this, if I go back to create another new one and say I want to do this using a custom script, we'll give it a name and we'll say I want to do a custom script. We get straight into a basic scripting window where they can run this through and then schedule it. So that's what we got to with the import exports and the templates around that. So yeah, we've got this scenario where we've prototyped these templates and put them together, but the finance teams think they're too complicated. The IT teams think they won't necessarily use them. They'll just go straight for the scripting option. So as far as conclusions go, that's pretty much where we're at. With the processing rules, just very quickly, this is what I said, in this case, Mrs. Smith's council tax is coming in with the wrong reference. We can say that every time we import the ABC gyro file, we're looking for Mrs. Smith's incorrect payments. We'll put a title in there to tell us what it is. If we find the account ref contains Mrs. Smith's council tax, we can tell it to switch the account ref to this valid account reference instead and save that as a rule. And now each time that ABC gyro import file comes in, it'll process that file based on the import rules and then process the transactions based on the processing rules. So that's what we got to with those. So I'm going to pass back to Tony. I'm going to pass back to Glenn now to talk about architecture and infrastructure.
Thanks, Richard. Hi, everybody. I'm Glenn Conroy. I'm from Dorset Council. So yeah, just to talk to you a bit more about what went on in Alpha. So when considering the architecture and infrastructure, we decided it wasn't for just one partner to do alone. So what we did is pulled all three partner councils together and created somewhat of a design authority to start considering this. In the next slide, thanks, Richard, we identified all the journeys of the likely payment channels and how they would be facilitated and catered for by the IMS. And that told us then what integrations would be required as well. So you can see there's quite a lot there that we considered. We also considered what other systems needed to be integrated with, which is showed on the next slide. These fell into 4 general categories. So generally they were the integration with the payment service provider, the PSP, which in this instance could include gov.uk Pay as well. It would need to integrate with any kind of digital platform or forms engine that would be in place at any kind of authority, any council. The line of business application or the delivery system, so for instance, revenues and benefits or licensing application, and then obviously the finance system itself, it would need to integrate with that. At this point, so moving on to the infrastructure reference design, at this point we're not in a position to say here's what the final design looks like, but we needed a starting point of what the infrastructure design could look like for when we get into beta and start progressing that. So this would then give us a basis to start looking at how the support processes would work and how upgrades could be managed and things like that. It also gave us a basis to start calculating indicative cost models as well, which we'll come on to in a bit. On the next slide, we start talking about the cloud hosting platform. Just simply based on the previous experience and knowledge in the project team, we decided to base the cost model on the AWS platform. We're not saying it's limited to this, but that's just where we started based on this experience that we did have. On the next slide, we agreed early on that the deployment would also need to take on a single tenanted delivery, so each council would have their own implementation, so you wouldn't have a single implementation that then handles within the application each individual council. So we felt this is a much more secure and portable way of working. We also wanted the platform to be, the application to be platform agnostic. So we looked at containerizing it and looked at the application being deployed via Docker and Kubernetes. And just had a note that my video stopped working, so it always catches me in the best light. So let me just take that away from you. There you go. So yes, so we looked at containerizing the application using Docker and Kubernetes. This then enabled us to draw out a nice, quite comprehensive indicative reference design that we felt confident as being secure and scalable as well, which you can see there. We also considered the security element as well. So in the next slide, we had the security teams review our principles, and by using the combination of the native cloud infrastructure security, so within the cloud infrastructure itself, and then within the application security that also reinforces that, the security teams agreed that we had considered the security at each layer, which is obviously important. So moving on to support. We looked at the various support models, and we looked at the extremes of open source, where the source code is just available for an authority or for a council just to download and implement themselves and start supporting themselves. And at the other side, a SaaS implementation as well. So basically, a council would kind of divest themselves of that responsibility, and it would be for a support provider to maintain that application and provide that SaaS model. We also considered the middle ground, where it may be a hosted and managed agreement, but where the council wanted much more ownership or much more control over when upgrades happen, for instance, or any kind of extensions or enhancements or bolt-ons that may happen, or you know, it rather than it being a SaaS arrangement where a council is at the disposal of the support provider as to when upgrades and things happens. It's much more of a joint agreement there, an arrangement. We looked at professional services as well. We felt this was more of a service offering rather than a support offering. So it's something that can be called upon by an authority at any point. If they were running their own implementation, and for instance, they wanted some help with any kind of interface or with any kind of enhancement, then professional services can be called upon at that point. We then mapped the support models generally onto the personas that we had identified, and you can see basically with the scale of how technically self-sufficient a council would be or want to be. So it may be a council is very technically self-sufficient but chose not to be for this application. We can see that generally their personas would map onto the support models that we've identified as well. Okay, moving on to cost, which is obviously a key element if the IMS is going to be a viable solution. As with any project, it's very difficult to foresee everything and get exactly right, but we try to be as accurate as we possibly can, and we broke down the cost model by people and infrastructure costs. So for infrastructure, if you just move on to the next slide, please, Richard. Thank you. For infrastructure, we estimated that there will be a cost of around £4,000 per year per council. And then we also looked at the people around required to support, maintain, and continue to develop the product as well. We also added some elements of onboarding costs as well. So in the next graph, you can see that as more people are on board, the cost of the people and infrastructure goes up, which you'd expect. But as that overhead is shared amongst more authorities, the green line shows that the cost per council goes down as more people are on board, which you'd expect. So we identified that the key number here appears to be around 8 councils for the price to become competitive in this market. Thank you. We then started looking at service governance as well. With the shared nature of this product, it's important to consider how the income management system would be governed, and that's both technically and strategically. This generated quite a lot of discussion, and it was quite a mind shift for some of us who may be sort of used to a much more proprietary type arrangement. And that is the key here, that this is not a proprietary arrangement. So for this work, for this to work, sorry, it would need to be centered much more around the community and a consortium of customers all feeding in together to push that forward and make any changes that's needed. Okay, that's it from me. Back over to Richard, I think.
Let's go off mute this time. Okay, so conclusions. Just recapping on everything we've looked at there then. So we've looked at the landscape in which the service will run, the users and groups of users that will use it, how the new features will work for those users within that landscape, the infrastructure and architecture that we need to support all of that, The support options we then need to put in place for users to use all of that, the cost model and how much it'll all cost and how much we'll need councils to pay to run the thing, and then how we'll govern the service overall. So we think we've got a full wrap around how we might take this forward and how we might release it into the wild, as it were. Looking at our conclusions, we essentially need to consider the IMS to be middleware, because that is what it is. It sits in the center of all these different systems, line of business systems, banking systems, payment devices, and sort of handles all of that in the middle. So given the support models and the infrastructure we've looked at, it needs to be containerized, it needs to be portable. So we need to treat it as that, containerized, portable middleware. So whenever we're making any changes to it, that has to be at the forefront. We could look to partner with, we could have looked to partner with a single chip and pin provider when we got talking about that part, but that would then contradict that middleware approach. We're talking about a system here that can essentially integrate with anything as it needs to and as the landscape changes, as middleware typically does. So why would we go down the road of partnering with a single chip and pin provider when there are many in the market? It made more sense to not do work that would limit the thing. So the reference architecture we've designed, we think, is appropriate to support all of that. And as a final conclusion there, we think that we can lose some of those configuration interfaces because they're never going to meet the user need that we identified. That said, because those user needs can't be met by those interfaces with the complexities that are in the different file types, we wonder if there might be a piece of work to do around trying to standardize those file types. It would be a huge piece of work because it would mean liaising with lots of different system suppliers, but it would be akin to what's happening with open banking at the moment, trying to standardize the way data is transferred across the whole piece. Could we maybe, if we could get to that kind of mechanism where, you know, all the different file types coming in are all following the same format, we could massively simplify that interface and then probably give finance users their own import and export capabilities, import in particular. So the other conclusions, the 4 council personas that we've identified, we think are quite strong. They validate the support offerings that we've put together between the SaaS on the one extreme and the open source on the other. We've put together the indicative cost model, and we think that's pretty solid, and we conclude that we need around 8 councils to jump on board to make that pricing competitive. And then every council after that actually reduces the cost for every council beyond that. Having just said that about the council personas, we have considered whether there's a piece of work to do there again around doing that across local government. So for all 343 councils, is there a piece of work there where we could look at establishing a set of common personas with details and mapping which council aligns best with which? We think that might be a positive thing that would help other projects like this going forward if there's that kind of level of detail available. So something akin to that local gov procurement checklist, but a kind of persona checklist, if you like. We conclude that there are still significant benefits if we take this forward. There is the potential for lower cost of ownership than the incumbent products on the market at the minute. I'll not read through all of those, but you can see what they are. A lot of freedom, a lot of flexibility, a lot of openness in the product. Importantly, no hidden costs, which we know there are at the moment with the incumbents. From the research we did there, there are a lot of qualitative benefits. And that's been an interesting challenge for us as we've tried to put the benefits case together. A lot of them being qualitative and not necessarily quantitative. We couldn't really put numbers to them. Makes for an interesting benefits case for sure. Our objective with all of this remains to essentially disrupt the market. What we're looking at is by offering an open source option, we hope to encourage support agencies to set up their own SaaS and professional service wraps around it so that we're not just becoming another supplier in the market that does the same thing. If you remember from the discovery work that we did, we talked about having something akin to the WordPress model where the software is available for you to take and use as you like. But then there is a marketplace of providers who will give it to you and help you run it. And if you're not happy with one provider, you can move to another without changing the underlying system, because that's where a lot of the expense is if you have to change out the system. So what are we going to do next? Moving on to the private beta. So this is essentially what we had in the roadmap from the end of discovery. It hasn't changed too much. We still think we're on the right trajectory with it. We need to, aside from supporting the work that gov.uk Pay are going to do with the ATP system, we need to onboard a small number of partners into the private beta. We need to develop the new functionality we've described based on those prototypes. We need to stand up the architecture that we've described and put the system onto it, which will mean all the containerization and Docker and Kubernetes stuff that Glenn talked about. We need to establish the support wrap, which means talking about setting up contracts and sort of getting security certificates and looking at legal considerations. There's a lot of work in that. We need to engage some potential support providers as well if we are going to stand up, a sort of marketplace of support providers. And as we're doing that, we need to iron out any issues. Obviously, as we're onboarding new councils, we're going to learn a hell of a lot, I'm sure. So we need to work through that detail. So the plan is, based on the cost modelling that we did, to try and onboard up to 8 councils during the beta. We have the 3 from the alpha that we've been on, and then potentially up to 5 more. We're going to focus on the SaaS model to start with. We really need to do that because whilst we could focus on the open source model, that isn't going to give us the opportunity to test the infrastructure and the reference architecture that we've done and standing all of that up. So we need to stand that up. We need to put the system on there. So the SaaS model is the one to start with. And then, yeah, the big focus is going to be on the ownership model and the governance and how we get that right. That is it from us for the 43 slide version of the 161 page report. There is a lot more detail in the report. That was a bit of a whistle stop tour because we weren't sure how long it was going to take us to get through it all. It's 1:45 now, so it's taken us about 45 minutes. If there are questions, you can drop them in the chat, or you can just pop up and ask them if you'd like to, and we'll hang around here for 10 minutes or so and take questions. Thank you very much. Otherwise, you're free to leave, I should say.
Richard, can I just ask, is that full report available for anybody to look at?
It will be shortly. We haven't released it yet. We wanted to get the show and tell done and out of the way, and then we're going to discuss with Egley whether there are any final tweaks it needs, and then we'll release it. Yeah, so it's not out there right now.
Okay. So when I see that, then I'll have a look and have a chat with our people in Bradford and see what we think. Nice one. Cheers, Martin. Okay. Thanks a lot. Cheers then. Bye. Cheers. Bye. Bye.